Hello, this is Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group at Lake of the Woods, Virginia. Welcome to the recording of our program on February 25, 2022. Our speaker today is renowned and now retired National Park Service historian John Hennessy, most recently Chief Historian of the Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania National Military Park.
Always appreciate or understand sufficiently how lucky we are to live in a landscape that was so thoroughly documented. Most parts of America from the mid-19th century don't have a map of this level of detail, and some of them don't have maps at all. But we have innumerable maps, and of them, this is probably the best of them. This was done 2 years after the war. It was part of a concerted effort by the government to document the battlefields. And so there's actually one of these for each of the 4 battlefields here. And this is the northern quadrant of this map. Just to orient you a little bit, I know you really can't see. Ellwood is right here, Route 20 here. Here is the Germanna Highway. There's Route 3 going off to the east there. So you can see the intersection. So we are right up in here, right in here someplace. How many of you have seen this map before? Some of you have. And if you look at a map, there are 16 residents marked on this map. And for most people, those 16 residents constitute those who lived on this part of the battlefield. And so what I've done is I've redrawn this map for you. And there it is, kind of in clearer form, taking the sites that are marked on the 1867 Mickler map and showing them there. Pretty clear, pretty simple, pretty understanding. You can see clearly, you know, the importance of the open spaces here. Things are highly concentrated there. But what if you dig a little bit? So 1867 is 2 years after the war. Of course, the war begets a pretty substantial shifting of residences. Because what happens in 1865? If enslaved people hadn't left, they're now free. And so by 1867, they are finding their physical spaces that they will occupy. But the other thing that I want to point out to you is, so what I've done is I've gone to the 1870 census. Now the census of the time were taken in rather systematic ways. Now we don't have a map that shows us where everybody who appears on the 1870 census lives. There were, of course, in Spotsylvania, I think there were 995 households. Maybe on Civil War maps, maybe 50 of them appeared or so. But if you go into the census takers worked in order. They went from house to house to house. And they numbered the households. So you can pretty well guess that if the person in household 442 didn't live next door to the person in household 443, they were probably pretty close, certainly in the neighborhood. And so in the census, using the Mickler map, we can identify some key residences here. Spotswood, Orange Grove appears, John S. Spotswood appears on the 1870 census, 3 years after this map here. Dempsey appears, one of the McNeils appears up here. Down here, you have Childress, who appears on the census. Of course, Lacey's here as well. But my point is, there's enough people identified on the 1870 census to kind of outline the people that we know on this map. And what I did was I went to those names, and then I recorded all the households between them, which tells us really how many people lived on this landscape in 1870. So this is how it was recorded in 1867 by Nathaniel Mickler. But this is how many people actually lived there. So the difference is between, I think there's 18 households, 16 or 18 households on the Mickler map. I have the numbers here, excuse me. 56 households on this. So what is it, what do you think accounts for why Mickler chose not to record, and on almost all Civil War maps this is the case, chose not to record the majority of the 56 households that were present here in 1875. Some of them are black. Some of the people don't own land. In fact, of the 16 or 18 households on the 1867 map, I think the 1870 census, for those who are still present, which is most of them, all of them own property. So that's obviously a criteria. They may have been tenant farmers, sharecroppers. My point is that even a map, which we take as kind of a reflection of a landscape, is a very selective reflection of the landscape and misses a tremendous amount. This is your neighborhood in 1867. Now, I don't pretend that all the names on here are associated with that specific location. I put them near the reference point of what we have, knowing how the census worker works. But we know that these people, all these people, were living in this neighborhood. Pretty astonishing, actually. 56 household. Let's see, how many people? There was 208 people, I believe. Just under half of them white. But of the 56 households, there were 26 that were, 36, excuse me, that were white households. So it's not just African Americans who appear on the map of 1870. It's a lot of other people as well who were not recorded by Mickler when he was here a little bit earlier. So this is a complicated landscape. We're going to get back to this a little bit later and in a slightly different context. But I use this just to suggest to you that digging teaches us things. Digging gives us a different understanding of a landscape or a place or a story than we might have had before. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I'm curious, and this is not a rhetorical question, why do you study history? You're the study group. I've never spoken to any other study group in the world in my life. So why do you study history? What is it? What do you get from it?
It's our past,
It's our past.
obviously, and you want to keep it alive.
Keep it alive. So you want to remember.
Yeah.
You're helping society remember.
Understand choices, why choices were made.
So could be inspiring choices.
Right.
Could be cautionary tales of mistakes made. All of that. How many of you find inspiration in history?
Occasionally.
There's no right there. I do, 100%. That's what got me into this business in the first place. There's lots of inspiration. There are amazing people from whom we can learn a great deal. A lot of evil characters, too. We live in a world right now that doesn't seem to be very interested in hearing about some of the hardships on a landscape like this. The work of historians isn't just to distribute facts, but to help us understand why these stories, why these places matter. Why do we bother? Do we do it just for amusement? When I started in this career, I thought that's what we did. That we told stories to kind of give people something to do on a Saturday afternoon. Oh, there was a kind of a patriotic element to it, for sure. Sent people away, made them cry, sent them away. They loved America a little bit more. And Until someone came up to me one day and said to me, he was working at Manassas at the time, he said, "How can you do this?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "How can you talk about death every day?" And I didn't really have an answer for that. I think most of my career has been kind of trying to figure that out, an answer to that question. Why is it that we do what we do? Why does it matter? Is it important? Is it amusement? I have my answers to that question. I suspect you do too as well. In 1828, or thereabouts, William Jones, the owner of Ellwood, and his neighbor Nathaniel Gordon, who lived up in this area here, if I go back, there it is right there. Nathaniel Gordon, the family, he was dead by then, but the family still owned the property. So Ellwood is down here, Gordon's up there. In 1828, William Jones and Nathaniel Gordon each gave permission for one of their enslaved people that they owned, Anthony and Patsy, to be married. So that's a sentence that includes lots of, a few facts, right? But what does it tell us? There's a lot about America in that sentence. A lot. So I'd like to kind of use this example and this story to kind of explore history. Explore your neighborhood a little bit. Maybe reveal to you some things you didn't already know, and maybe get you to think a little bit about why we do the work that we do. You know, we all wish that we had a nicely bound and ribboned set of letters written daily by everyone who lived on this landscape. But of course we don't. At Ellwood, for example, we know out of its, how many 200 and some odd years of history, 60,000 days or 70,000 days or more, we know what happened on that landscape with any specificity, maybe 100 of those days. People always say, well, we can't interpret slavery because we don't know very much. Well, holy cow, we don't know very much about any of it, really, when you get right down to it. But we feel more comfortable interpreting those things that come to us in bound or wrapped bundles of personal letters. A narrative. We love narrative. That's the low-hanging fruit. History, though, that is dug out is harder because we don't get the whole picture. We get a little piece here and a little piece there, and eventually it'll all fit together in some sort of a mosaic. But that's not going to happen in my lifetime. This story, this project I'm working on now is not going to be finished by me. But hopefully we'll have the outline of a picture that people who follow will fill in. And if we do, we'll know a good deal more about more people on this map than we have in the past. So think about when you study history, think about this map. Because this is the history that gets in the books. These are the people that appear in the books. And as you can see, it is 1/5 of the story, oftentimes. So I think it's pretty, we've talked, there's several Ellwood volunteers here. Surveys of the volunteers, conversations with them, I think there's always been a lot of frustration or reticence about interpreting slavery and enslaved people at all. Or anyway. And the quickest answer is, well, we don't know very much about it. Well, that is true in the sense that we don't have that ribbon set of letters, but we do have pieces and parts that go into the mosaic. And so this is a story of how, today's talk is a little look at how we can use, where do we get those pieces and parts? And what can they help us understand about these places that we work at and we love and we drive by every day. So where do we go? Well, we go to the maps. That's one. Maps are incredibly valuable and important. But we have to understand that a map like that is a pretty limited window on the past. We can go to the census. And that's where this takes us. All of that, each of these names, the bigger ones, each of the names I added, it's just one of those pieces of mosaic that we didn't know was there before. And we may never learn anything more about some of these people. But I can also tell you that some of these people have fabulous and interesting stories that are important for us to understand. We can go to newspapers. With the proliferation of digital stuff online, boy, we have access to a resource that, when I started out, was a very difficult resource to use and was very rarely used. But newspapers, boy, you want to know what's going on in the world on, April 3rd, 1846? There's about 500 online newspapers across America that'll tell you what's going on in pretty much every neighborhood in America at that time. The issue in that respect is not finding information, it's what do you do with all the information that's out there? There's too much of it, as a matter of fact. And then, where else you go? We go to court records. That's pretty exciting stuff. But we're going to spend most of our day today, our time today, in court records. And I think you'll find that it really can be. We're not going to get into the legal minutia of court cases. But we do want to look at what these court cases can tell us that help us understand this map rather than the preceding one. And along the way, I think we can learn some things that matter to our nation at large. So we're going to deal with really three court cases today. Two of them deal directly with Ellwood and are related to wills. Now I know the excitement level is building in this room as I describe this to you. Because I have been in talks that focused on genealogy and wills and stuff like that, and holy cow, I'm not going to do that to you. And if I do, just put your hands up collectively in the air and I'll stop. There's an 1852 case brought by Lucinda Gordon, who was the daughter of Nathaniel Gordon. I pointed Nathaniel out. On my glass, Gordon's right there. Lucinda Gordon is the woman who married William Jones when she was 16 years old. That's what she's famous for, unfortunately, because he was 78. But let's set all that aside, because her experience tells us all sorts of things that are important to understand about 19th century America. And then there's another case brought by Betty Lacy and Horace Lacy, the eventual owners of Ellwood, and Lucinda Gordon owned Ellwood, or had rights to use Ellwood after her husband died, William Jones died, up to the point where she got remarried. And then the estate passed to Betty Churchill Jones Lacy. But 2 years later, Betty and Churchill would sue her mother. Betty and J. Horace Lacy sued her mother over her administration of the estate. Specifically, that she had dared to sell enslaved people while she had control of the Ellwood estate. We're not going to get into the legal parts of that, but it does tell us something. And finally, we're going to get to the mother lode, which is an 1873 estate case in New York City. In New York City, the surrogate's court in New York City, and you can feel the excitement level rising, that adjudicated the fate of a man named Anthony Jones, who had been a runaway slave from Ellwood in 1835, but who died with a $13,000 estate in New York City. claims of his family to that estate. An estate that had yet to determine whether or not a marriage undertaken in slavery, remember that first sentence I read to you? William Jones and Nathaniel Gordon gave permission to Patsy and Anthony to marry. That's the factual in 1828. Well, Anthony died in 1873 after running away with a $12,000 estate. And his family naturally went to court to claim it. And that is the motherlode on the nature of enslavement and the function of slavery on this landscape where you all live here today. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Let's talk a little bit first about the 1852 case. So this is Lucinda Gordon, the young bride, we'll call her, marries William Jones in 1828. He dies in 1845. His will gives her a life estate at Ellwood. She eventually, after she remarries, she sues because she was forced during her tenure at Ellwood to fund the expenses of running the place out of her own money. And she argued that those costs, expenses should have been funded out of the estate at large. So it's kind of not a very interesting question. She lost, by the way, her suit. But, so what does this case tell us? So we're talking about a 3-year period. William Jones dies in 1845. Lucinda gets married in 1848. So she's in control of the Ellwood estate. The first question that came up in court is, what is Ellwood? What is the estate? And it's very clear that there was a wide-scale understanding that Ellwood, and this is not maybe important to all of you, but it certainly is important to the Ellwood volunteers, that Ellwood, as it was largely understood at the time, was a discrete property within William Jones' estate that amounted to 640 acres around Ellwood itself. Now, mind you, at the time of his death, William Jones owned 5,000 acres, including the Woodville farm, right up here, including lands all the way down to the tuning place, and the tap field, and all of that was owned by Jones and then Lacey. But this court focused on what part of that estate that she was given life estate on was intended to sustain her. She wanted the income, for example, from the operation at the Wilderness Tavern, which was not part of the Ellwood estate. It was part of Jones's ownership and always was, but it was not part of the estate, the court said. So she said, here's an example of one of the questions that came up. Lucinda Gordon argued some 6 or 8 female laborers were all that were capable of cultivating the farm during her ownership. Now, mind you, Jones's estate listed 60 enslaved people at the time of his death. Several of those were being hired out. There were only, and the case makes very clear, that the vast majority of those who worked on Jones's property by the time he died were pretty much ready to die themselves. That they had been there much of his life. Out of the 60 enslaved people, only 6 or 8 were physically capable of working the fields at Ellwood in 1845. She wanted the income from the enslaved people that were hired out. She didn't get that. And we learn little things. These court cases have little detail. I covet the names. We know, for example, that a woman named Millie, when Betty Churchill Jones Lacey was born, A woman named Millie was her nurse, her wet nurse, nursed her, literally. And when Betty's first children were born, she may have also been present at that later date, although we're not sure about that. So there's a tremendous amount of information in this case about individual enslaved people. And whenever I run across a name, and it's usually just a first name or a nickname, I record it. And slowly we're building an idea of who these people are. We also know from this case, and this is relevant to this place, that in the last 10 years of his life, William Jones was virtually, and in the end, literally, blind. And so he relied on a neighbor to become his agent. And that neighbor lived here. You can see this house right here. Anyone seen this picture before? It's a sketch of Orange Grove, which was John Spotswood's house. Spotswood was a wealthy, relatively speaking, not fabulously, not on the scale of J. Horace Lacey, but a reasonably wealthy man, very well respected, the grandson of Alexander Spotswood. And his house stood very close to the entrance, on this side of the road to the entrance of Lake of the Woods. But he would become the agent. Jones hired him for $500 a year to manage his affair. And in fact, at the time of Jones's death, most of the debt accrued by the estate were payments to Spotswood for supporting. So the man who was managing the estate suffered the debts in order to keep it going. Spotswood testifies in this case and provides lots of information, including some about his own place. He names 15 enslaved people that worked at Ellwood. And it's very clear from his testimony that the number of enslaved people actually active and working in the 1840s is far lower than we presumed. Most of the enslaved people were classified as charges. In other words, they were subject to the support of the owner only and provided really no useful labor to them. When asked if Jones was competent in his final years, he lived to be 95 years old. I think that's true, maybe 92. Spotswood said he was sound in mind and good health, but not in the habit of keeping books well, he said. I did this, but he was blind, very near to being blind, but his mind was very clear on business transactions. In fact, just days before he died, William Jones, in his 90s, was sitting on a horse up here near Orange Grove in one of these forests there, cutting down some from timber that he had purchased. Among those who testified in the case was Alfred Apperson. Now, I don't have his name on this map, but Alfred Apperson lived right off the map down here. His son John would become well known because he left a great account of his experience during the war as a hospital steward in the Confederate Army. But Alfred Apperson was one of 3 overseers that we can identify associated with Ellwood. But he was also overseer at Woodville Farm up here, where the mine was as well. He testified that the Woodville estate was considered better land, and there was not as many inefficient hands, men, and women to support, and is considered at the present day the better plantation. Now, how many of you knew that? Ellwood's famous, but Woodville, which came into William Jones's ownership when his brother Churchill died in the 1820s, Woodville was the better farmland. And you can actually see that this whole open space here most of that was the Woodville farm, as a matter of fact. So this is all the Wilderness Valley. Wilderness Run runs like right through the middle of that. And all of this is the Woodville farm. But very distinct, owned by Jones, but very, very distinct. Now, another case we want to talk about is one that came in 1854, and this is when J. Horace and Betty Lacey, now the owners of Ellwood, Betty being William Jones's and Lucinda Gordon's daughter, they would sue Betty's mother, Lucinda, over her management of the estate while she had control of it. Now, they argue that her management of the estate denied Horace and Betty the full value of the estate that would eventually come to Betty. And you won't be surprised to learn that much of the argument concerned the management of enslaved people, and specifically the sale of enslaved people. One of the reasons that this case is so interesting is it reveals to us in real active time the concept of coverture. I don't know if any of you know what that means, but it was a concept of law that provided that when a man and a woman married, they, under the law, at least practice, became one. Which meant, of course, that the man eventually took control over the woman's property. Now, it's interesting, we know from this case, for example, that William Jones, remember, Lucinda came from a pretty well-off family, the Gordons here, and she received an inheritance all of her own. And when they got married, it's interesting, William renounced his rights to her inheritance. Surprised me a little bit. When J. Horace married Betty, he didn't do that. That's why everything that you see is associated with J. Horace and not Betty. And this all causes lots of problems. But coverture shaped women's lives at the time and limited their rights and their ability to manage their property. Even the fact that Lucinda was given a life estate only for her property. It wasn't conveyed to her. She could use it, and then it was conveyed to her heirs, and she had exactly one child, and that was Betty. So it was all targeted toward Betty. Betty never got the protection, the renunciation from her husband, and so the land went into joint ownership and became essentially J. Horace Lacey. There was some resentment in the neighborhood that Lacey had married into all this money. There's one great account that says he's just broken down aristocracy who happened to marry well, and thus became one of the largest landowners in Spotsylvania County. Now, so you'd think if I sued my mother, or if my brother sued me, I'd be pretty pissed off about that. But apparently, this did not. I mean, I think people went to court more readily and frequently than they do now, at least without the animus. And in fact, the Lacey's in their court filing stated very clearly that we don't mean to imply anything negative about her. We just think that she shouldn't have been able to do some of the things that she did. Namely, sell enslaved people, turn enslaved people into cash that she could have spent, and thus reducing the amount of the estate that would pass to Betty. And that was the source of the challenge. And the Lacey's lost. And they lost with some prejudice. The courts ordered them to pay all the court costs, not only theirs, but Lucinda's. So you kind of like, but it's also a precursor. Because in 1858, the Lacey's go to court again. Not against this estate, but against Betty's half-sister's estate, Hannah Coulter at Chatham. And that's a bigger story. That's a story with national implications. Because Hannah Coulter, in her will, gave her enslaved people a choice. She had 94 of them. She gave her enslaved people a choice. Said, you can pick a new master if you want, you can stay where you are, or if you want, you can go immigrate to Haiti or Liberia or some other place. And if you do that, I'll give you $50 to help fund the trip. While the Lacey's, who ultimately, Betty would ultimately be the recipient of the estate, although she wasn't directly, the Lacey's went to court on behalf of her, Hannah Coulter's disabled daughter, who would die in 1858, and argued that because enslaved people were property, they had no legal right to make any choice at all. And they challenged the will. Now, there were two cases in Virginia at the same time that challenged manumission on this basis, because it was a fairly common thing for slave owners in manumitting or attempting to manumit to give enslaved people choices about where they would go. Instead of just saying you're free, it kind of set a structure. It wasn't it wasn't freedom necessarily, but it was choices. And in fact, it was these two cases that were probably mentioned or referenced in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln mentions the cases in Virginia that are addressing this question, which are making manumission even harder than it had been before. That was right after these cases came up. But in any account, the Lacey's go to court in an attempt, a second attempt to retain the rights to enslaved people. And this time, closer to the Civil War, a few months after the Dred Scott decision, this time they won. And 93 people, because one of them was given his outright freedom. 93 people were retained in slavery in the estate at Chatham, which eventually would pass to the Lacey's. So you do that, and you kind of like, I'm not really liking the Lacey's very much right now. Yes, they are a product of their time. But they twice went to rather extraordinary efforts to assert their ownership of human beings. So that case doesn't have any testimony with it. That's just the legal arguments, and the courts read them and they gave a decision. So that's all we have. But it does give us a window on how this society worked and what prompted people to go to court sometimes. Now, let's get to Anthony Jones a little bit. Anthony Jones, we'll stick to this map right now. Anthony Jones was the product of an enslaved family that I've been able to track back to about 1780 or so, when the patriarch of it, which is very unusual, by the way, to be able to track an enslaved family for almost 100 years in slavery. The patriarch's name was Anthony Smith. He was known on the plantation as a preacher. Doesn't necessarily mean that he had any ordination or anything like that, but was accepted for a role in the religious practices. But he would marry in 1805 or after 1805 and then have 3 children. One of whom was named Anthony. Another one whose name was Isaac, and another girl named Elizabeth. He actually had other children as well. They had other children as well, but they would die. So there would be 3 that grew to adult. And all will be relevant to our story. Anthony Jones, who is the protagonist in our story, he's the man who dies in 1873. He is, he's the oldest. He's born about 1805 based on the census. And sometime in the early 1820s, he met an enslaved woman named Patsy. Patsy was owned by the Gordons. And probably not coincidentally, Patsy her job was the body servant, if you will, the mistress or the caretaker of young Lucinda Gordon, the woman who at 16 years old would marry William Jones of Ellwood. And so as she came to age, or approached age, and William and Lucinda became known to each other, they already knew each other and had courted somewhat at a distance for many years. In fact, Patsy recalled that Anthony paid a good deal of attention to me and visited me frequently. Remember, Anthony is Ellwood, Patsy is up on the Gordon estate. The courtship continued for 6 or 7 years, he says. Eventually, Anthony would ask Patsy to marry him. She even recorded the moment. I remember very clearly, Patsy recalled many years later, that when he asked me to marry him, I was sitting at a loom, weaving. He took hold of the shuttle and said he would not let go until I had promised to marry him. That's kind of romantic, is it not? The next step, of course, was to get the permission of the owners, which they apparently readily accorded. And sometime in 1828 or thereabouts, the couple was married. At about the same time, William Jones married Lucinda Gordon. And so Lucinda Gordon, or Patsy, who was Lucinda Gordon's enslaved person, came to Motel. And so Patsy and Anthony would live together for about 7 or 8 years. Now we know from the court case over the estate, this is where all these details come from. It's from this court case. They took up residence, the two of them, in a, quote, little house called the Laundry. Now it wasn't a laundry, we know that, because then she says it was 2 rooms in it, about 3/4 of a mile from Mr. William Jones's great house. So where it was, we have no idea. But it does tell us that the activity of enslaved people was very much dispersed across this landscape at Ellwood. They lived as man and wife because remember, the trial in 1873 included Patsy coming forward as his widow. There was no marriage records for weddings that took place, or marriages that took place in slavery. So how do you prove it? Had to go prove in court. In fact, the whole purpose, the whole major importance of the 1873 to 1876 case over Anthony Jones's estate was to determine the legality in New York State of a plantation wedding that had taken place in Virginia. And of course, there were tens of thousands of enslaved people who had been married similarly without any legal documentation at all. And each state had to resolve its own approach toward those marriages. In Virginia, it was resolved very directly in the Constitution of 1870, which simply declared that all such marriages would be recognized in Virginia. But none of the northern states had to deal with the problem until these people started to move into northern states. So lots of little things emerged that maybe you hadn't thought about. The whole question of certifying marriages among enslaved people when they became free, when there's no legal record of it. That's a pretty big deal. I mean, you know, have you ever tried to rent a car with your wife and not have your... In the state of Arizona, to this day, I know because we did it, if you go with your wife to the rental counter and put her on as a second driver and she doesn't have your last name, the man's last name, you have to have your marriage certificate to do it. There's lots of little bits, I know that. I almost went to court over that. The couple, and she had to testify, so these are all little interesting details, part of the mosaic. The couple lived by themselves as man and wife, quote, separated by very little during their marriage. I was faithful to him, and I believe he was true to me. Part of their marriage, Anthony was hired out by Jack Chancellor, another little detail, to work the mines at Woodville. Of course, Woodville was a gold mine. But Patsy said he came home every night and he stayed with me at the laundry building. So there's really more detail about that couple than we have about most couples. We don't know William Jones's sleeping arrangement with his wives, but we do know Anthony and Patsy's. Over the next 3 years, they would have 3 children together. All 3 would die young. And then in 1835, Patsy would become pregnant again. But in 1835, we don't know whether at the time Anthony knew that his wife was pregnant, but something happened in 1835 that caused Anthony to decide to run away. And sometime in the late spring of 1835, he decided he was going to go. We don't know what triggered it. We do know that at the time, Patsy was newly pregnant. We do know that Anthony is described as being badly ruptured at the time and used a truss. So What does that mean? Are there any physicians in the audience here? Any doctors? Well, if you go back into the 19th century medical literature, a rupture means a hernia. I'm not exactly sure what a truss would do, but they were constantly sold for hernias at that time. But it's pretty clear that labor on the farm had caused Anthony to experience something pretty painful. But for whatever reason, he decided that he would run. In her testimony in 1875, Patsy betrayed no bitterness at all about this decision of him to run. She said simply, "My husband tried to run away." And when you read her little testimony, it almost sounds like it was his duty to do it and expected to do it. And he did. So his freedom quest would lead him north out of the Ellwood grounds toward the Rapidan River, across maybe a Culpeper Mine Ford, across the neck of Culpeper County to the Rappahannock River, where he crossed probably about 3 or 4 miles above the confluence near where Deep Run is today, up into Stafford County to a place that Patsy referred to as Spotted Farm. So if you know Stafford County, there's a place, historic place, in the western part of Stafford County known as Spotted Tavern. And that's almost certainly where he was captured. His escape almost certainly prompted a mobilization of all the local resources that were in place to track down escaped enslaved people running away, sheriffs. There were slave catchers whose job it was. There were organized governmentally sponsored slave patrols. We don't know how long Anthony was on the run. We do know that he made it only about 15 miles. So maybe a day or two. We don't know where he was going, other than he was going north. He was captured. And at that point, William Jones decided that he would respond not sympathetically, but harshly. And he ordered that Anthony be taken to Fredericksburg, and he was sold to a slave trader named John Ellis. And he would be, therefore, sent south to be sold. Now, Patsy provides a good deal of information on this because after all this plays out, at some point she hears again from Anthony who tells her this story. So she's telling his story. He is taken to the Ellis jail, as she calls it in town. I was like, because I know Fredericksburg really well. I didn't know that. But as it turns out, it is a slave jail that I knew about. I just didn't know it had been owned by the Ellis family, which is the family, by the way, that built the town hall, many other prominent buildings in town. And it's interesting. So here's where things get really kind of interesting. Remember, Lucinda Gordon, her mother, Elizabeth Ellis Gordon, was a sister in the Ellis family. And so when Anthony, so Patsy, of course, is Lucinda's servant, if you will. Her mother, Elizabeth, Lucinda's mother, Elizabeth, is an Ellis. And when Anthony is captured, he is not returned to Ellwood, but sold to a slave trader named Ellis in Fredericksburg, who managed the jail. And Patsy records, and this is pretty remarkable, that she received permission from Lucinda to travel into Fredericksburg and to stay in the jail with Anthony at night, and to go out during the day and work for the Ellis family who lived in town. So she's actually in Fredericksburg, and I found a description of this jail by a northern traveler at almost exactly the time, in fact it is exactly the time that Anthony would have been in this jail, which was at the corner of Wolf Street and Sophia Street, a site that was just recently built over with new houses. This traveler said, as we turned a corner of the yard, I observed 2 or 3 Negro women from outside conversing through the fence with some who were confined in the yard. I mean, that could have been Patsy visiting during the day with her husband. The trader is said to have had about 150 on hand at this time, whom he was soon to send off overland to New Orleans. The windows of the buildings appropriated to the use of the slaves were grated with iron. Well, he stayed, and the reason he was held in Fredericksburg for so long was because it was the heat of the summer. And John Ellis, a slave trader, was going to physically drive them, as in cattle, in a group overland. This is 1835, mind you, to New Orleans. And so he waited until this heat of summer passed. And so finally, probably in September of 1835, while Patsy was still in Fredericksburg with her husband Anthony, John Ellis gathered his group, his gang of enslaved people, no doubt forming a couple, neck to neck or hand to hand, and started out west. We know exactly how they came. They came west out what is today the Orange Turnpike, Route 3, and they got to what Patsy called the Red Gate at Ellwood. Now my guess is that's the main entrance to Ellwood off of Route 20, the old Route 20 where it crosses Wilderness Run and comes up the hill, and then there's a left that goes into the driveway, the old driveway. There, the slave trader stopped, and Patsy was able to say goodbye to her husband. And Anthony, as she described it, she said, I bade Anthony goodbye. He wept very much, and we were both greatly distressed. The slave trader tried to console her, suggesting that maybe he would not be able to be sold because of his injury, but in fact they would never see each other again. So John Ellis was right in that he would not be sold. He could not be sold. And in February of 1836, John Ellis got on a boat, the Yazoo, in New Orleans, heading back to the eastern seaboard. And with him was Anthony Jones, the enslaved man. But for Anthony Jones, along the way, John Ellis got sick and died on board ship. So Anthony Jones just stayed on the boat until it got to New York. He got off in New York. He brought the trunk, John Ellis's trunk, to the captain of the ship, and he told him he was going to go to church. Got off the boat, he disappeared into the streets of New York. And he does not appear again until 1873, after he dies. We know that he eventually found work as variously called an engineer or a fireman at an asylum, as it was called, for the deaf and dumb, and on 162nd Street in what is an area known today as Washington Heights. If you've seen the movie Washington Heights, that is right in the neighborhood where Anthony Jones spent most of his life. He would amass a fortune of about $12,000 in the remaining time of his life until the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1862. Anthony Jones was a fugitive. He was subject to rearrest at any time during that time, had the Lacey's decided to send him. You maybe know the case of Ona Judge, George Washington's enslaved woman who ran away to New Hampshire. She spent her entire life a fugitive, subject to rearrest and recapture at any time, if you can imagine the stress. Frederick Douglass ended up in New York City just 2 years after Anthony Jones. But he, by virtue of some labor by his friends, was able to get his owner to relinquish his rights. So he did not live as a fugitive, but Anthony Jones lived as a fugitive until the Emancipation Proclamation in New York City. Patsy, she remembered vividly, gave birth to her son 2 months and 4 days after her husband's departure from the Red Gate at Ellwood. Anthony Jr. Was born, and she apparently heard nothing of Anthony Sr. for years until finally she received a letter probably in the 1840s, obviously describing his experience. It was a dictated letter. She dictated a letter back, and they never had any more contact after that. We don't know why. We don't know what her letter said to him. She always, in all of her testimony, she seemed very fond of him. But each would go on and remarry. Complicates the court case, right? They would each remarry. Of course, Anthony would marry a free woman. Patsy would marry an enslaved man named Minor, Gabriel Minor. So she comes down to us as Patsy Minor. And they would go on. Now, Patsy and Gabriel, Anthony's wife, wife, and then their son, remained in enslavement until emancipation. Of course, Patsy was owned by Lucinda Gordon, so when Lucinda Gordon remarried in 1848, she moved to a place called Greenwood. It's right here in Spotsylvania County, and that's where she would live out her life. I think she died in 1863, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong about that. In any event, at the end of the war, people began to move. One of Anthony's siblings, Elizabeth Keaton, moved to one of, in 1858 or so, while still in slavery, moved to one of Lacey's other plantations in Louisiana. He owned a couple of plantations in Louisiana. The other brother stayed here, Isaac, stayed here, and at the end of the war, they would begin to try to find their way. On this map, in 1870, we know, I want to point out two. There is Isaac Smith, that is Anthony's brother, younger brother. His sister, their sister, was Elizabeth Keaton, the one in Louisiana. And there is Gabriel and Patsy Minor. They are 4 households away from each other. So it's interesting, in 1873, when Anthony Jones of New York dies, there's a lot of Anthony Joneses in this story, but when Anthony Jones of New York dies, somehow word gets back to the plantation, to Ellwood. Because on his deathbed, he had said that he was a slave of Lacey, of William Jones of Ellwood. And so word gets back here that he has died. And Lacey goes to Isaac, who by then is about 50 years old, and Elizabeth, who still lives on his plantation in Louisiana, who's just a little bit younger. But he is supporting both of those families. Now, he feels entirely responsible for them, and he's supporting them financially. Isaac is living as just a sharecropper on the Woodville farm up there. We don't know what Patsy and Gabriel Minor were doing. But in any event, Lacey gets with Anthony's brother, Isaac, and his sister, Elizabeth, who he also used to own, and offers to go to court with them, be their lawyer, to claim the estate in New York City. It's a very interesting kind of window on J. Horace Lacey, because number one, he was supporting both families, one here and one in Louisiana, so when his $12,000 would end that responsibility. And also, he was trying to sell a piece of property, probably down here, probably, I believe, the new quarter, new design quarter that he had built in the 1840s here. I think that's probably right in that area. He wanted to sell them to Isaac. And so getting this settlement would be great for J. Horace Lacey. He'd get them off his rolls, and he'd get to sell them a piece of property as well. And so he takes them to court. And that's why the court case becomes famous. Former owner represents former slaves in court to claim this estate. But, you know, if we go back here, all right, Isaac lives 4 doors down from Anthony's former wife, Patsy. So somehow, apparently, Patsy didn't hear about this for about a year. And then after all the newspaper coverage of this benevolent but extremely self-interested slave owner representing his former slaves in court, she gets wind of it and she says, wait a minute, they're brothers and sisters. I'm his wife. And more than that, he has a son who by then was living in Mississippi. And so eventually, the son, who's also named Anthony, the son and Patsy join their cases, and they go in to challenge for the entire estate. And that's what begets the trial. And so the courts ultimately rule, in a landmark case in New York law, that the plantation wedding in the 1820s between Patsy and Anthony was valid, and that she was his widow, despite the fact that both he and her had married in the intervening years, that he was her widow. And that meant, though, bad news for her, that her son was first in line for the estate. And so the $12,000 went to the Mississippi wing, the Mississippi son, Anthony Jr. of the family. So it's interesting, one of the things that I haven't been able to crack. So it gets a lot of press. Lacey loses again in this case. He never really practiced law. This is one of the very few instances I can find that he ever practiced law, but he had studied law for a while. He was mostly a politician and a planter. But eventually, Isaac himself moves off of this land and lives on the Orange Turnpike in Spotsylvania County. That's all we know. Maybe he eventually did find a way to buy the land from Lacey. No one's ever done the deed work to kind of track how Lacey sold off the 5,000 acres that we know as was in his ownership in 1860. But Isaac would eventually go here. Patsy, after the trial, we know nothing about her. Her husband died in 1875. She was 75 by the time the trial took place, and she died without any more information being available about her. But what about the descendants? So I've spent a little time on Ancestry, and to try to figure out where these people are. Now, let me go back. So on this map, you can see the highlight, the bold, the ones in bold. These are all African American families. So only about a third of the increase of residents on this property from the Mickler map in 1867 to the 1870 census are African American. But they are almost all certainly formerly enslaved people, either at Ellwood or some of the other farms around here, Orange Grove, Spotswood's Place, or whatever. So a couple of names. Andrew brought us here. You see that. You see the name Tansomore over here. These are all families that would marry into each other. And when you see this, you're seeing just a part. I've identified over 300 descendants, collateral and direct, from the three children of the original Anthony and Esther, preacher and her wife, preacher born in 1770 or so. So we have hundreds of descendants. Almost all of the known descendants, so there's three branches of the family. Anthony Jr., who got the money, we know the least about. His name was Anthony Smith. Smith is a devilish name to track, as you know, genealogically. And after 1880, I have found no evidence. And it's an important question. Caleb McDaniel wrote a book 2 years ago that won a Pulitzer Prize in history, looking at the effect, looking at a case study of a woman who sued her former master for the value of her work while she was enslaved, and the courts gave her $7,000. and the dramatic effect that $7,000 had on generations of that family, who became lawyers and doctors and all of that. I have hopes that someday we're able to track the effect of this money on that wing, Anthony Jr.'s wing of the family. But so far I haven't been able to do that yet. Elizabeth Keaton, she lived in Wachita County, or Parish, in Louisiana. Her family would reside there until the 1920s and then begin to disperse. There's a big chunk of the family that lives in Gary, Indiana, and another big chunk that lives in Contra Costa, California. And I guarantee you, none of them have any idea that they're descended from this family or part of this family. The biggest part of the descendants of the original Anthony and Esther up here comes from Isaac's line. He is the one who lived right here and then eventually bought property down here. Most of these are descendants. Tansomore, Comfort, Catlett, Lambert. As I worked through this, I knew I was going to find people I knew. And there are people I know in this tree. I haven't told them yet. I'm not sure really what to do with the information. I mean, in a way, it's a heroic story. You know, this man braves all the perils of escaping slavery, goes to New York and builds a life and leaves a legacy. And, I mean, that's a tremendous, we don't know that story among many people in this world, even though we don't understand yet all the details of his life in New York. I think we'll eventually find out some more about him. But that's a tremendous story. But I'm also tempered by the fact that, you know, I did a lot of this work, you know, back in my Park Service days, or my actually, this is a COVID project, if you want to know. I did a lot of work, most of it on my own time, but while I was still Park Service, and you know, going up and saying, hey, you know, I work for the federal government, we've been looking into your family background, and this is what we've learned, and it's kind of pretty cool. Not everyone would have a happy response to that. So I'm not quite sure how to go about this. But one of the names in the line that shows up is Catlett. And many of you may know Marcy Catlett, who's the superintendent of schools in Fredericksburg. Her husband is a direct descendant of this line. I haven't really told her that. I told her I had something to talk to her about that I think she'll be interested in, but I haven't been able to share the details. Howard Lambert. Some of you know Howard Lambert, very active in African American history in Culpeper County. His name appeared in his family name, and it was through the Tansomore family. And so he's related by marriage, but the Tansomores are still very present. Comfort, Tansomore, there's 6 or 7 names that are still, if you open the phone book, they're all over the place. And most of these people are related in some way to this story. So, to those who say we don't know, and we can't talk about it because we don't know enough, I would say we need to dig. That it's the digging that tells us things that we don't already know. And, you know, for me, this has been really just kind of a remarkable historical ride. There are people out there who would find discoveries like this oddly uncomfortable and say we shouldn't be doing this in this day and age. But I would argue that giving identity and voice to people who have been long forgotten, I'll just flash back and forth there, been long forgotten, is a worthy goal anytime, any place. So that's a little adventure I had for you today. And so if you're interested in studying history, dig. Thanks. Questions? Yes?
I have a couple of questions. Number one, you brought up the Ambersons in your talk. Is that the same family that has RV
relationship, but I'm certain that it is. They've owned land in the Route 20 corridor forever.
Number two, how long did it take for your research to be done?
Well, it's not done, because the one thing I haven't done yet, I haven't been able to do yet, is to go to New York to pull the court files. Now, we have lots of testimony that was published in the newspaper, but I know that the court files include the testimony of 7 to 10, perhaps, and former slaves. So we haven't learned probably a tenth of what we're going to learn from this, if indeed there is the testimony there, and I believe there is. So that's one of my projects coming up, is to go to New York.
It sounds like a book.
I don't know if it's a book, but I just hope it's useful, and it is, for me, there's no kind of like revolutionary scholarly revelations here, but there is the ability to apply these kind of big ideas of history to our local community here and understand how they played out in this landscape.
Well, one last question, and then I'll stop. But I'm a member of the Orange County Historic Society. Did you do any research on this using their research?
I have not yet. I have at this point just pretty much worked through the census and the records that I have. So this case came to us. I found a newspaper account of the trial about 15 years ago. And I think Bob Epp has seen that, and Bob Lucaville's seen that. And I read it, and I whoa, this is pretty a lot. I don't know what to do with this. So I just kind of set it aside. And every once in a while I'd look at it, and I'd look at it. And I know that I think Bob had done some work on it. And but then I picked it up a couple years ago, and I said, let's see what we can learn about this. And so, you really kind of have to just map it all out, who's who, and what are the relationships and everything, before you can track it. So I did that, and then I started working on it. But there's a lot to do yet, a lot to do. When we pull the court files, I expect that we'll learn much more than we know now. But it's a great human story too. And as interested as I am in Fredericksburg history, it illuminated a whole aspect of Fredericksburg history. We have never known, except in one case, the story of an enslaved person who was jailed, kept in any of the slave jails, prior to being sold in Fredericksburg. And now we have two.
Can you explain that the Lacey's owned Ellwood? I understand that. When did they buy Chatham? Did they own them both at the same time?
So they bought Chatham in 1857. They bought it from the estate of Hannah Coulter for $35,000 or $37,000, which J. Horace thought was too much, but he did it because Betty Lacey spent most of her childhood at Chatham. Although she was born in Ellwood and her family seat's at Ellwood, her sister Hannah Coulter, or her half-sister Hannah Coulter, and her husband John, who was a judge, much older than Betty. Remember, Betty's the product of Lucinda Gordon's marriage with William Jones. So her half-sister Hannah Coulter is 46 years difference. So that's a lot.
Yeah.
So she was essentially raised in the summers at least in the summers, by Hannah Coulter. She spent a significant part of each year at Chatham. So she was very fond of the place, and apparently it was one of those marital requirements that J. Horace find a way to buy Chatham, and so we did. And they subsequently went to court to challenge the will, the manumission. It wasn't really a manumission; it was just a kind of an arrangement that was made, but it was widely viewed as a manumission at the time. There was only one enslaved person who was manumitted outright by the Hannah Coulter will, and that was her favorite Bucky. And that was good, but it was the question of giving enslaved people choices that the court said they have no rights to do that, which follows directly on Dred Scott, which essentially proclaimed that black people have no rights that white people are deemed to respect. That was the constitutional ruling of the day.
Obviously exciting times for Ellwood interpreters.
this up in kind of an article form. I haven't really released it yet because I want to get to New York and see what's in the records up there before we put it out there. You know, writing something like this up is a challenge because you're doing that seminal work of history, so it really is a documentary process. It's not, I can make it somewhat literary, but it is, you know, it's heavy stuff. As for the panels and stuff, that's not my problem anymore. So, no, you can talk about this. You know, it's exciting. I think it's important for us to see what else we can learn from this, because I know the learning isn't done. And once that's done, I think that we do take a step back and see how we interpret slavery at Chatham through exhibits. This information we'll share at training. We talked about it at training last year at Ellwood, and we'll probably do that. I know Becca's asked me if I would come back and do that again this year, which I'm happy to do. You're probably all getting, some of you are probably getting sick of hearing about this stuff, but it is interesting, and every time I do it, I'll try to kind of focus on a different aspect of it. Bring it up. Good questions. John?
On a few of your national park tours, you like to say that Spotsylvania County events inspired two American novels, The Red Badge of Courage and Roots. And so my question is, the Waller Plantation inspired the Roots novel. How well has that been documented compared to the Lacey property and your research?
So, you know, I've always been kind of curious that Spotsylvania County has two of maybe the most 5 famous historical novels ever written set within its midst and never even mentioned. I find it curious. Red Badge of Courage is set at Chancellorsville, and Roots, of course, is largely set in the Waller Plantation in southern Spotsylvania County. You know, we know, and it's not my work, you know, when Roots came out, it simulated, of course, an intense kind of examination of the historical record as it relates to Haley's book.
Right.
And it's pretty clear that there was no such person. There was no person named Kunta Kinte. There may have been someone like Kunta Kinte, but the evidence shows that Toby, who was Kunta Kinte, actually came to the plantation much later than is represented in the book and in the film. And I'm not an expert on all of that.
Sure.
But the plantation, there are remnants of the plantation today. I don't think there's probably 15 people who've ever been there with the purpose of actually seeing it. I've been there once, years and years and years ago. I mean, it's way out there. You've been there, I think, have you not?
On the fringe of it.
Yeah, it's way out there. So
But with the popularity of the novel, trying to find the fact versus the fiction, did that inspire anybody to research?
yeah, there's a good article that was done in 1981 that kind of parses it. I don't know that anyone's done anything since, but I might have a copy of that. So send me an email, and if I do, I'll send it to you. And if I don't have it, I know the park has it. But I think I probably do. Noel has it for sure. Yes.
A lot of black families, enslaved families, took their surname on their owners. Did you find that to be the case for the black families listed here?
So it's interesting. That's a very good question. Some of these, so for example, the patriarch of the family was known as Anthony Smith. And in fact, the man I call Anthony Jones, which I do for clarity's sake, was also named Anthony Smith for most of his life. He switched his name to Jones once he was in freedom. Now, whether he did that out of a pure desire to just kind of conceal himself, or whether it was, it's hard to imagine he did it to honor his former owner who had him sold away from his family. I think we're pretty safe to say that's not what the motive is. So we don't know in that case. There is a wide-scale presumption that enslaved people often took the names of their owners. I'm not aware of any study that has really looked at the question of the origin of surnames among formerly enslaved people, but I do know that locally we have one example, or one really solid source. Caroline County in 1868 did a census of all African Americans in the county. And they listed their names, and they listed their former owners, if they were enslaved. And of course, Caroline County had the largest enslaved population of any of the counties in our neighborhood these days. And of those, I forget how many, hundreds and hundreds, probably a couple thousand people on that census. Of all of them, only 2% had their former owners' names. I think that's very much an open question that is very much subject to the assumption and kind of hearsay, but honestly, we really do not know. Certainly Isaac Smith, Elizabeth Keaton, sister, they did not take the name Jones, and they certainly didn't take the name Lacey. But it's a good question, so why don't you dig on that a little bit, see what you find. Jack?
I have this question. On this map, where we see the name Captain Beale, roughly in the Flat Run Church identified, the intersection of Flat Run and Germanna Highway, I see your other development of names, and I'm wondering,
So Beale's right, Captain Beale's
what
right
do you,
there, Flat
what do you know? Well, I don't know who Captain Beale is.
So Captain Edward Beale was a veteran of the War of 1812. He is a brother of William Beale, who we know as, who was born in Falmouth, and Edward Beale was born in Falmouth as well. We know William Beale largely because of his wife, whose name was Jane Howison Beale, who left a great diary of her experience in the Civil War, Jane Beale's diary. So Edward Beale was Jane Beale's brother-in-law.
And the people who are living there now, in that community, it gets populated here later on in one of your other maps. Do you know where those people came from?
So
There.
yeah.
Peter Miner.
I don't have a sense, and it's not something I've looked at closely. I don't have a sense that there is a descendant community that still survives on this landscape of formerly enslaved people. I could be wrong. I'd be curious to know, but that's a good question. We know of, there are a few descendant communities. There is one on Lee Hill School Drive in Spotsylvania County, south of Fredericksburg, that is descendant from the enslaved people of Belvoir and Marengo and some of the plantations down in that area. Of course, there's Cookstown down here, although that's not really I don't know that to the extent that that was a descendant community, because William Cook, who was the namesake for it, was a free black man. But he happened to have 26 children, so you could build a whole town around 26 children. Well, at least that's what he claimed to have had. But I don't know the answer to your question, whether there's a descendant community here. It would be an interesting question to look into.
A follow-on to that, John, I'm not sure that I know either, but I can tell you there's a study in the Orange County Historical Archives concerning the Flat Run Freedmen's community, after the Civil War. So
I need to get my hands on that,
Yeah,
because
I
I'd
would
be curious
assume-
if these names endure in that community.
Yeah, we need to take a trip
Yeah.
down there for sure. And I think Frank Walker may have been the author of that. I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
But I know there's some literature down there that's going to have
Right.
impact on all this.
Okay.
for
Well,
sure.
we'll make a plan at our next lunch.
Was it Patsy that brought the case to claim the part of Anthony's, or claim Anthony's estate? It was just I found it interesting that, having been a former slave, that she already has the right to bring the case. I wonder, did she bring the case, or did her owner, who wanted to
So this all happened in the 1870s, so she was a citizen by then.
So I was just wondering if she already had the right to.
Prior to the 13th and 14th Amendments, enslaved people could not testify, in Virginia, could not testify in court. So if there was a crime committed against an enslaved person by a white person, the victim could not testify in court. And you know, that was obviously a barrier, but it was also used sometimes. For example, Mary Minor Blackford, who lived in Fredericksburg, she used that same reality to protect herself against teaching enslaved people to read. Because she said, the only people who witness me doing this are enslaved people, and they can testify against me, so I'm just going to keep doing it. So it cut both ways. But by 1873, she had all legal rights to go into court. And remember, it was Anthony of New York. The first challenge was from his brother and his sister, one in Louisiana, and Isaac. Isaac was his brother. They first challenged it with Lacey's help. And then Patsy found out about it, and Patsy and her son, who lived in Mississippi, who had been enslaved at Ellwood, but moved to Mississippi sometime right after the war, they challenged the application from Isaac and Elizabeth. So there were two competing claims to the estate, and the courts ruled that she and her son were entitled to it. And by that, they essentially said their son.
I'm curious about how a New York court could tell Virginia what to do. Was it a federal court?
No, it was a state court. So they weren't telling Virginia what to do. Isaac, when Anthony Jones died, he lived in New York. So his estate was probated in New York. And the reason this became a court case is because New York had never addressed the question of how New York was going to deal with weddings between or marriages between former enslaved people that were undocumented, were not legally recorded. And so every state had to go through this process. Virginia did it through its constitution. So in 1876, when this decision came down, they weren't telling Virginia what to do. Virginia already recognized these sorts of marriages. They were saying, this is what New York will do from this point forward.
Okay.
Yeah. So it is, and that's why it got one of the reasons it got so much attention.
Were you surprised that so few of the slaves on Ellwood were actually capable of working
Yeah.
at that time? And were there laws in Virginia and other slave states that required owners to keep the elder or disabled slaves?
Yeah. There were no laws that I'm aware of. It was custom, however, to do that. And that custom extended into the Reconstruction era, although those relationships were usually governed by the Freedmen's Bureau. And one of the major jobs of the Freedmen's Bureau was to ensure that contracts were fair and enforced and all of that. It was still kind of oftentimes conditioned marginally above slavery. As to the condition of the plantation in the 1830s and 40s, I was surprised by that. We have this concept that Ellwood or Chatham was one thing, but like anything, they rise and they fall. And clearly, Ellwood had kind of atrophied along with its owner, and by 1845. And clearly, one of the reasons that the Lacey's were intent on going to court was to challenge her mother, Lucinda, and then later her sister in the Hannah Coulter case, was to revitalize Ellwood. And Lacey was widely praised for revitalizing the Ellwood plantation. One of the hardest things, I know Bob Epp has a big blue binder that's full of plaques and all that stuff, which are it's very hard to understand. But it's very clear that at the time, Ellwood was understood to be the core 640 acres. And everything else was land owned by the Lacey's or the Joneses. But we've come to call it Ellwood, but they didn't really see it as Ellwood. I mean, there's an extensive testimony in here about how the operations of Woodville, which was Churchill Jones's old farm that went to Williams when Churchill Jones died, pretty big, I think about 2,000 acres, that those operations and the operations at Ellwood were scrupulously kept separate. Although today, when we count the acres at Ellwood to include 5,000, we include that acres as part of Ellwood, and it really wasn't. So you have to make the distinction between what was owned by the person and what was considered to be part of the plantation itself. Charles is standing up, so I think we're done.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much, John. Once again, lots to digest, and we'll look forward to asking you back at some time in the future. Lest anyone had mistaken assumptions, this setup here in the corner does not mean that we're serving you lunch. Our Vice President, Jack Finn, well, why not? If not, why not? Has a short
Yes, very short.
comment to make.
Okay. I guess, I guess the first observation is to simply say that John will be presenting again at the annual dinner at Fawn Lake of the Friends Wilderness Battlefield.
No legal cases.
No legal cases? Okay. Good. And so I think it's worth mentioning that. Second of all, I'm going to run over here real quick and get a thing.
He's running over to get a thing, and you'll find this very interesting. Hopefully, we've had some words lately, and hopefully he's not going to use it on me.
Isn't that a silly man after he gave me such a nice introduction? Now, of course, I'm speaking next month, right? What an act. What a performance to follow. What an act, a performance to follow. But anyway, I may come bearing this again. But this is going to be an item for auction or for raffling at our dinner on the 14th of May. It is a replica of Stonewall Jackson's sword, General's tassel, okay, that was originally purchased as an item to be given away if someone got a hole-in-one at a fundraiser for the study group, okay? But we're going to give it a new home. It's in my closet. My grandchildren know where it is. Oh, please. Anyway, we want to let you know about that. And anyway, so you have heard a historian's presentation this month. I'd invite you to come back next month to hear a fourth grade history student's presentation on what he's found out about his picture. Okay?
The digging that he has done. So thank you very much, Jack.
Sure.
We look forward to that, and we look forward to seeing, Bob,
Let me rephrase something you said earlier, Charles.
yes,
The March 12th event at Confederate Cemetery is
I thought it was March 9th.
12th.
Oh, 12th.
Saturday the 12th.
Oh, okay,
The first one, 19th is the second one.
all right,
The alternate. Is not cleanup. It is the placement of more markers, replacement markers on the Confederate stone in front of the disintegrating Confederate stones of that time.
okay,
There.
thank
If you
you.
don't know, the Confederates buried there are basically reinterred soldiers from the Wilderness Battlefield.
Correct. Okay, thank you for that. So, without further ado, we thank you for your attendance, and hopefully we'll see you next month. Before you go, please remember to visit our website often, civilwarstudygroup.org. We make every attempt on a regular basis to provide informative content. Thank you for visiting, and God bless.